Hello, U.S. history students. In this presentation, we're going to talk about issues related to the end of World War II. We're going to talk about the physical end of the war in the Pacific. We'll talk about the plan to end the war in Europe. And then we're briefly going to talk about the Nuremberg trials and treatment of prisoners during the war. So let's start with the physical end of the war. As we go through this presentation, okay, you're welcome to take your own notes or if you want, or please feel free to use the worksheet that I uploaded on Canvas. That might be an easy way to organize the material, okay? So let's talk about the physical end of the war in the Pacific first with the atomic bomb, okay? Now, in Europe, by April 1945, okay, the Soviets are coming at Germany from the east. The British, the French, and the Americans are coming at Germany from the west and the south. And by April 1945, there's nowhere to run. Hitler commits suicide, and the German army surrenders. Okay? In the Pacific, all right, once Germany surrenders, we turn our attention to Japan. Now, the Soviet Union and Britain had promised to help us. In Britain, Churchill gets voted out as prime minister, okay, and Britain begins to remove itself from the war. So Britain's not really going to help us in the Pacific. We are more concerned about the Soviets coming down and trying to spread communism into the Pacific and spread communism into Japan. So our goal is to try to end the war as quickly as possible in the Pacific before Stalin and the communists can get there as well. Okay? So we talked in the last presentation, Okinawa and Iwo Jima are going to get us the closest to Japan, but it comes at a heavy cost. A lot of casualties for us and a lot of casualties for Japan. Early reports indicate an all-out invasion of Japan is going to cost at least a million American lives, if not more, and that's not including the Japanese casualties. And we know that the Japanese are very, very loyal. So reluctantly, the new president, FDR, has passed away. The new president, Harry Truman, decides to use a new weapon, the atomic bomb. So the person decided to use the atomic bomb is the new president, Harry Truman. Now, this is Little Boy. Okay, Little Boy was dropped on Hiroshima on August the 6th. It had an explosion weight of 15 kilotons. Okay. This is Fat Man. Fat Man was dropped on Nagasaki on August the 9th with an explosion impact of 21 kilotons. Okay. So Truman, in order to end the war quickly, prevent more casualties, decides to drop the bomb. We're going to choose the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Okay. They are commercial centers, not the capital, but they're commercial centers. Why are we doing this? Because if we take the war to the civilian population, then the civilian population will put pressure on the military and the government to end the fighting. Okay. Before we dropped the bomb, we distributed pamphlets around Japan telling the people, okay, if you surrender, you will avoid needless destruction and needless death. So we tried to get Japan to surrender. Now I know, we can discuss, would Japan have done that? How seriously did we think they were going to take those leaflets and everything? I know those are all good arguments, but we did try to get Japan to surrender before dropping the bomb. So why do we do it? It's going to be faster and it's going to prevent more U.S. casualties. It's also going to prevent more Japanese casualties. A land invasion would have cost more American lives, up to 1 million lives, and had really would have caused Japan to take a lot longer to surrender. The results: Japan surrenders, and there are horrendous casualties. Okay, and we see here pictures. This is the fallout in both Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and some of the city. In fact, this cathedral, to be honest with you, or this building right here, was left this way as a memorial to how destructive the atomic bombs were. Okay. And for years afterwards, there's going to be casualties and people die from radiation poisoning and sickness. Another result of the atomic bomb, as horrendous as this is, and I really understand that Truman did not take this decision lightly. But another result of the atomic bomb is nobody's used it since then. Okay. And I think it would take a country like the United States to be able to use it to show people how bad it is, and then to arrive at the conclusion we should never use this again. I mean, think about it. Hitler could have developed the atomic bomb first. There are other dictators. Stalin could have had it and stuff like that. Do you think those guys would have hesitated using it if they had it? No. Okay. In fact, that's what's scary about some people that have nuclear weapons today, is they simply don't care. Another one of the results of the atomic bomb is it took a nation like the United States to use it. We showed the world, look how horrible this is. Let's never use it again. Okay? Versus some other countries that would have used one and just kept going and going and going until they blew up everybody. Okay? Now, in Europe, you had a Yalta Conference. Now, the reason I bring this up, technically the Yalta Conference happened before the bombings at Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But I bring up the Yalta Conference because the Yalta Conference is going to plan the end of the war in Europe. It's also going to set the stage for where we're headed next after this unit, and that's the Cold War. Now, the people that participated in the Yalta Conference are the big three, okay? Churchill from Great Britain, Roosevelt from the United States, and Stalin from the Soviet Union. Truman is not at the Yalta Conference. I'm going to go on and give you a heads up. There's going to be a quiz question that says, which of the following was not at the Yalta Conference? The answer is Truman. Truman is not president yet. FDR is still alive. Okay, so it's FDR, Churchill, and Stalin. Why? What is the purpose? The purpose is to decide what to do with Germany and what to do with Europe at the end of World War II. We do not want a repeat of World War I that punished the losers and led to the rise of the dictators in Germany and Italy. So we're very cognizant of that. We want to prevent some of the problems that occurred at the end of World War I. All right, we don't want that to happen in World War II. The decision is to divide Germany into 4 Allied-controlled districts. Okay, Soviets are going to get a district. The British are going to get a district, the French are going to get a district, and the United States is going to get a district. After a certain time, the idea is those districts will become independent. They can rejoin together if they want to, but they will have their own government. What we know is going to happen is that East Germany is the Soviet district. It will become communist. The 3 Western districts, the British, the French, and the United States, will join together as West Germany. They will become capitalist and democratic. And that's going to set the stage for a division in the Cold War. Berlin, the capital of Germany, is also divided into 4 districts. The Soviets will get East Berlin. The British, the French, and the United States will get sections in West Berlin. And West Berlin is going to become an island of capitalism and democracy surrounded on all sides by communism, because Berlin is technically in East Germany. Also, it is decided at Yalta that we are going to replace the defunct League of Nations with the United Nations. And guess what the United Nations is going to have? It's going to have an army, and it's going to have U.S. support. And because it has an army and because it has U.S. support, it's going to have power. So it is going to be stronger than the old League of Nations. In fact, it's going to be headquartered in the United States. It's going to be headquartered in New York City. Okay? And again, what we're trying to do is we're trying to prevent some of the problems that occurred after World War I, so we don't see another world war erupt. Another big event at the end of World War II, the Nuremberg trials. Now, we're going to talk about the Holocaust next week, but the Nuremberg trials are in response to the Holocaust. We are putting Nazi leaders on trial for war crimes and crimes against humanity. Now, a lot of your big Nazis, Hitler, Goebbels, some of Hitler's other underlings, have committed suicide. Right? And the trials not only go after the Nazi leaders, but they also go after bankers and politicians, guys that signed legislation that targeted the Jews and other undesirable groups and fueled the flames of this persecution. At the end of the trial, 12 of the defendants were sentenced to death. Okay. Some by hanging and most by hanging. Okay. And you also had some receive life sentences in prison and some receive lesser sentences and some were acquitted. The evidence against them was not enough. And the story of the Nuremberg trials is very, very fascinating because the whole point is we are trying to show that we are morally superior to the Germans, okay, and morally superior to the Nazis. So we wanted this to be a true legal trial. And if the evidence didn't exist, we couldn't convict. Okay, so some of the defendants are going to go free. The verdicts, though, emphasized individual responsibility regardless of orders. Okay. The defendants had argued that they were following Hitler's orders. And what the trial shows is that no, you always, no matter what the order is, you have the individual responsibility to say no. So each one of these defendants that is convicted could have said no and chose not to. So following orders is not a good defense. You had individual responsibility to stand up for what you believed in. If you knew it was wrong, then you had the responsibility to say no and try to stop it. Now, the last thing I want to talk about here with the end of the war is the treatment of prisoners during the course of the war. Now, there's a document known as the Geneva Convention. Okay, the Geneva Convention was signed way before World War II. And the purpose was to ensure the humane treatment of prisoners of war by establishing rules of war. Okay, you can do this, you can't do that. And again, it's supposed to protect prisoners. As great as this is, in reality, the treatment of prisoners often reflects the savage nature of conflict and culture. So at the end of the day, some people are going to follow the Geneva Convention, some people are not. Okay? When it comes to prisoners of war in Europe, despite how bad Hitler is and Mussolini is and even Stalin, despite how bad those people are, when it comes to the treatment of prisoners of war in Europe, most European countries are going to follow the Geneva Convention. And we see a greater degree of humane treatment of prisoners in Europe. Japan is a different story. Because of the savage fighting, I mean, think about it, kamikaze pilots and dive bombers and things like that. Because of the savage nature of fighting in the Pacific with Japan, the treatment of prisoners is savage. And the best example of this, or the worst example of this, is the Bataan Death March. The Bataan Death March occurs in the Philippines in 1942. It was the forced transfer of U.S. prisoners to prison camps. About 60,000 to 80,000 prisoners are marched across a period of 5 days, 65 miles to San Fernando, which is where they're going to disembark. Okay, and you can see here they're marched from the Mariveles corridor to San Fernando, and then from San Fernando, they're going to be taken to these prisoner of war camps. So between 60,000 and 80,000 are marched across 5 days. Thousands die, and they die because they suffer physical abuse all along the way. They're being beaten, they're being starved, they're being tortured, okay? And thousands are going to die. You don't see that happening in Europe. So at the end of the day, we've got this document that's supposed to protect prisoners of war, the Geneva Convention. But in reality, oftentimes the culture and the conflict dictate the brutality. And in the Pacific and Asia and Japan, the fighting's horrendous, so the treatment of prisoners is horrendous. Now, those are real quickly just some issues related to the end of World War II. There's a little checkup on this. Be sure you review this material before you take that little quiz because it is not open notes.